The letter fell from Opal Pritchard's fingers and landed face up in the red Arizona dust, and for one terrible, suspended moment she could not breathe. She had ridden 3 days by stagecoach to reach Caldwell Creek, a sun-baked settlement at the edge of the Arizona Territory, carrying nothing but a carpet bag, a broken engagement ring wrapped in a handkerchief, and a dream she had already decided to bury. The dream had a name. It had a face. It had been her fiancé, Mr. Lawrence Holt of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, who had written to her 6 weeks ago with words so cold and so final that she had read them 4 times before she understood what betrayal felt like when it arrived in an envelope with a wax seal. But the letter now in the dust was not from Lawrence. It was from the land agent, a man named Forsyth, who had been managing the small parcel of property that her deceased father had left her in the Arizona Territory. It was the last thing her father had ever given her. 120 acres along the Gila River, deeded in her name in 1883, the one piece of the world that still belonged to her. And the letter said the land had been sold. Not by her, without her consent. Forged signature, Forsyth had written regretfully. Believed the buyer acted in good faith. The money, he noted, had already changed hands. Opal stood in the main street of Caldwell Creek with dust on her boots and a future that had collapsed twice in 6 weeks, and she felt something dangerous rising in her chest. Not grief, though grief was there too. Not fear, though fear had its place. What rose in her chest was fury, clean and sharp as a knife pulled from a sheath, and it steadied her hands when nothing else could. She picked the letter up. She folded it. She walked toward the sheriff's office. She did not know yet that the man who would take her case, who would ride out with her into the scorched and beautiful wilderness of the territory, who would stand between her and the worst kind of men, was leaning against the wall of that very office, hat pulled low, arms crossed, watching her come toward him with an expression that was equal parts wariness and something he had not felt in a very long time. Opal Pritchard had come west to bury a dream. She did not yet know she was about to find one worth living for. 6 weeks earlier in Philadelphia, the city had been cold in February of 1884, the streets glazed with ice, the parlors warm and suffocating with propriety. Opal had been 26 years old, which her mother reminded her regularly was older than was fashionable for an unmarried woman, and she had been engaged to Lawrence Holt for 14 months, which her mother reminded her regularly was long enough for him to develop his opinions about her character. Opal's mother had not said it in those exact words. She had said, "Men like Lawrence do not wait forever, and you do try their patience, Opal, with your opinions about land rights and your correspondence with the Land Reform Society." She had said these things over needlework while Opal had sat across from her with her hands folded and her jaw set, and her eyes fixed on the frosted window. Opal had opinions. She had always had opinions. She had inherited them, she suspected, from her father, Abraham Pritchard, who had gone west in 1878 to claim a parcel of land along the Gila River, and who had written letters home full of wild, extravagant descriptions of the desert in bloom, the height of the saguaro cactus, the particular quality of the silence that settled over the territory at dusk. He had died of fever in 1881, leaving the land to Opal and leaving her with a grief so quiet it had never fully surfaced. She had planned to visit someday. Then Lawrence Holt had come into her life, and someday had been pushed further away. Lawrence was 34, handsome in a polished, deliberate way, partner in his father's shipping firm, and possessed of the particular brand of confidence that comes from having never been told no by anyone who mattered. He had courted Opal with flowers and theater tickets, and the assumption that she would eventually stop expressing herself so forcefully at dinner parties. He had been wrong about that. He had tolerated it for 14 months, and then he had written her a letter. The letter had said, in its careful, lawyerly phrasing, that he had come to believe they were not suited, that he had found in the previous month a woman of more agreeable temperament, that he wished Opal well, and hoped she would understand that this was the right decision for both of them, though he clearly meant it was the right decision for him, and that her feelings on the matter were secondary. Opal had read it 4 times. Then she had gone to her desk and written 2 letters, one to the Land Reform Society declining her membership because she needed every coin she could preserve, one to the Land Agent Forsyth in Arizona Territory, requesting a full accounting of her father's property. Then she had gone to her mother's parlor and said, "I am going west." Her mother had dropped her needlework. Opal had not waited for a response. She had sold her good jewelry, the pieces Lawrence had given her, and the pieces that had been her grandmother's, and she was sorry about the grandmother's pieces but not about Lawrence's. She had packed the carpet bag. She had purchased a stagecoach ticket to Tucson, and then a second ticket north to Caldwell Creek, and she had boarded the first coach on a gray March morning with the feeling that she was stepping off a ledge into open air. The journey had taken 12 days in total, crossing through country that changed so dramatically it felt like traveling through multiple worlds. The prairies giving way to desert, the sky expanding until it was something you could drown in, the heat building even in early spring until it was a physical presence, pressing against the coach windows like a great warm hand. Opal had spent the journey reading her father's letters again. She had brought all of them, tied with a ribbon, 43 letters spanning 3 years of his life in the territory. In them, he described the land in detail that was almost loving. The way the Gila River caught the late afternoon light, the cottonwood trees along the banks, the hawks that circled the mesa to the north. He had built a small house, hired 2 hands, begun running a few head of cattle. He had been building something. He had been building it for her, she understood now, reading the letters at 26 instead of at 19. He had been building her a future in case Philadelphia ever stopped being enough. He had known his daughter. Caldwell Creek had appeared around a bend in the road as a collection of wooden buildings fighting the desert for permanence. A main street of perhaps a quarter mile, a saloon, a general store, a post office, a livery stable, a church whose white paint was peeling in long strips, a hotel with a porch that sagged slightly to the left. Behind all of it, the landscape unfurled in shades of amber and rust and violet, enormous and indifferent and somehow magnificent. Opal had stepped off the stagecoach, collected her bag, and walked to the post office to collect the letter from Forsyth. And then she had read it, and the letter had fallen from her fingers into the dust. She was still holding the folded letter when she pushed open the door of the sheriff's office and stepped inside out of the glare. The interior was dim and smelled of wood smoke and leather and gun oil. There was a desk, a rack of rifles, a potbelly stove burning low, and 2 cells in the back separated from the front room by iron bars. There was a deputy, young and wide-eyed, sitting at the desk, and there was the man leaning against the far wall. He straightened when she entered. Dexter Underwood was 30 years old, tall in a way that was functional rather than decorative, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that wanted to be longer than his hat allowed. His eyes were gray, the particular gray of storm clouds over flat country, and they assessed her with a directness that would have been rude in Philadelphia and was simply honest out here. He wore a sheriff's badge on his vest, which surprised her slightly, as he looked nothing like the lawman in the dime novels she had never quite managed to stop reading. He looked like a man who had been outside for most of his life. He looked like a man who had made difficult decisions and had not been broken by them but had been changed. He said, "Can I help you?" She said, "I need to report a crime." Something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly, more like attention, the way a man looks when something he has been expecting has finally arrived. He said, "What kind?" She unfolded the letter and set it on his desk. "Fraud," she said, "and forgery. Someone sold my land without my consent." The deputy leaned over to look at the letter. Dexter did not look at the letter, he looked at her. "What land?" he said. 120 acres along the Gila River, she said. "Deeded in my name by my father, Abraham Pritchard, in 1881. I have never sold it, never authorized a sale, and never signed anything transferring ownership. According to this letter, a forged signature was used to execute the transaction. Dexter crossed his arms. Abraham Pritchard, he said, and something in the way he said it made her look at him more carefully. You knew him, she said. I knew of him, he said. He died 3 years back. His land has been contested since. Contested, she said. By whom? He picked up the letter. He read it slowly, and she watched his jaw tighten by degrees as he read. Man named Colt Garrison, he said when he was done. He's been accumulating land all along the Gila corridor for 2 years. He is not known for being particular about how he does it. Opal felt the anger in her chest sharpen further. Is he known for forgery? She said. He is known for finding men who will do the paperwork for him, Dexter said. He set the letter back on the desk. Miss Pritchard, I have to be honest with you. Reversing a land transaction in this territory is not a simple matter. You would need to prove the signature was forged, which means you would need a legal expert, and you would need to contest the sale in territorial court in Tucson, which means time and money. I am aware of the process, she said. He looked at her again with that gray-eyed directness. Are you? She felt the edge of condescension in the question, or perhaps she was accustomed to looking for it. I spent 2 years corresponding with the Land Reform Society of Philadelphia, she said. I am not unacquainted with land law. The deputy made a small sound that might have been amusement. Dexter said, Do you have any documentation? Your father's original deed, correspondence, anything that establishes your identity as his heir. She opened her carpet bag and produced a folded envelope that contained the original deed, her father's will naming her his beneficiary, and a copy of his death certificate. She had brought them on instinct, not fully knowing why, some part of her always prepared for a fight. Dexter took the documents and spread them on the desk. He studied them with the careful attention of a man who read slowly and thoroughly and trusted himself to understand what he read. These are solid, he said after a while. He looked up. Where are you staying? The hotel, she said. Good, he said. Stay there tonight. Don't go near Garrison's outfit or his men. Don't make it known in the saloon that you're here contesting anything. These are important instructions, Miss Pritchard, and I am asking you to follow them. She did not like being told what to do. He seemed to understand this already. I am not trying to manage you, he said, and there was something in his voice that was different from what she had expected, something that was almost respectful. I am trying to make sure you don't walk into a situation that becomes dangerous before I have time to understand what we are dealing with. We, she said. He looked at her with those storm cloud eyes. You came in here to report a crime, he said. That makes it my concern. She studied him for a moment. Then she picked up her documents, folded them back into the envelope, and tucked it into her bag. I will be at the hotel, she said. I expect to hear from you tomorrow morning. You will, he said. She walked back out into the heat and light. She did not look back, but she was aware, in that particular way that has nothing to do with sight, that he watched her go. Dexter Underwood had been sheriff of Caldwell Creek for 3 years, having taken the badge after his predecessor retired, and the town council had spent 6 months unable to agree on anyone else. He had not wanted the badge exactly, but he had understood it was necessary, the way a great many necessary things had entered his life and settled in without ceremony. He had come to Arizona Territory in 1878, the same year Abraham Pritchard had come, though they had arrived by different roads and for different reasons. Dexter had come from Missouri, where he had been working as a cattle drover after 2 years of a life he did not speak about except in the broadest terms. He had built his reputation in the territory through a combination of honest dealing and the particular kind of physical courage that is not recklessness, but the calm management of dangerous situations. He had never married, which the women of Caldwell Creek had opinions about. He was, they agreed, not opposed to company. He was not cold or unkind. He was simply, as one of the older women at the church had put it, not a man who could be reached by ordinary means. He had not argued with this assessment, though he had thought about it sometimes. usually in the quiet hour before dawn when the desert cooled and the coyotes fell silent. He thought about Opal Pritchard that evening while he sat on the porch of the office and looked at the sky going orange over the mesa. She was not what he had expected from a woman who had come alone from Philadelphia with a carpet bag and a grievance. She was composed in a way that was not coldness, contained in a way that was not weakness. Her eyes were the color of the green glass in the saloon windows, and they had held his with an evenness that most men in this county could not manage. He thought about what she had left behind. He did not know the specifics, but the specifics were not hard to imagine. A woman her age, her bearing, her obvious intelligence, arriving alone in the Arizona territory was not doing it because her life back east had been entirely satisfying. Something had broken loose. She had pointed herself west the way people pointed themselves west when everything behind them had stopped being enough. He recognized it because he had done it himself. The next morning he rode out to the land. He went alone before breakfast in the gray half-light before sunrise, because he wanted to see it before he talked to Forsyth or Garrison or anyone else who would put their own framing around it. He crossed the 6 miles to the Gila River in less than an hour, the horse moving easily on the hard-packed trail, and he came over a low rise and saw the Pritchard land spread below him in the early light. It was beautiful. He had forgotten, or perhaps he had not been paying attention before, how beautiful this particular stretch was. The cottonwoods along the river were leafing out in the early spring, their new leaves catching what light there was, trembling in the slight morning wind. The river was running clear and cold from the winter rains. The ground between the river and the mesa was good, flat, dark with the slight fertility of flood-deposited silt. He could see why Garrison wanted it. He could also see the remains of Abraham Pritchard's house. A low adobe structure, partially collapsed on the west wall, the door hanging open on a broken hinge. The corrals were empty and the fence posts were leaning, but it was there. The bones of what the man had built were still there. Dexter sat his horse and looked at it for a while. Then he turned back toward town. He found Opal at the hotel dining room, eating breakfast alone with her back to the wall, which he noted with approval. A woman who put her back to the wall in an unfamiliar place was a woman who was paying attention. She had changed into a different dress, a simpler one, lighter in color, more practical for the heat, and she had done her hair back in a way that was less elaborate than the day before. She looked like a woman who was settling in rather than passing through. He sat across from her without being invited and signaled the woman behind the counter for coffee. Opal looked at him without expression and said, "Good morning, Sheriff. I rode out to your land this morning," he said. Her composure shifted very slightly. "You did? I wanted to see it before I spoke to anyone else," he said. "I wanted to understand what is at stake." She was quiet for a moment, and he thought he saw something pass through her eyes that was not quite grief but was close to it. "What did you think?" she said. "Your father had good taste," he said. "It is excellent land. The water access alone makes it worth considerable more than Garrison likely paid." She looked down at her coffee cup. "He told me about it in his letters," she said. "He described the cottonwoods." "Did you ever see it yourself?" She shook her head. "I was going to," she said, and stopped. He did not push. He understood the particular weight of things you meant to do and ran out of time for. "I spoke to Forsyth this morning," he said. "The land agent who sent you the letter." She looked up sharply. "And he is genuinely distressed about the situation," Dexter said, "or a very good actor. He says the man who came in with the deed and the signed transfer papers presented identification that appeared legitimate. He says he had no reason to doubt the transaction. He did not know you personally, had only communicated with you by letter. Is he complicit?" "I don't believe so," Dexter said. "But he is certainly negligent. The legal question will be whether negligence is sufficient to invalidate the transaction. And Garrison is a harder problem. He has legal documentation of the purchase, a bill of sale, a transferred deed, a receipt of payment. To undo that, you need to prove the signature on the original transfer was forged, and you need to prove Garrison knew it was forged. Opal set down her coffee cup. "Who did he use?" she said. "Who executed the forgery?" "That is what I am going to find out," he said. She leaned forward slightly, and he saw the intelligence in her eyes working through the problem. "If you find the man who forged the signature," she said, "and he can be shown to have had contact with Garrison before the transaction, that establishes the conspiracy." "Yes," he said, "and Forsyth's testimony that the man who presented the documents was not me would corroborate the fraud." "Yes," he said again. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" He looked at her across the table. He had been asking himself the same question in a somewhat different sense since the previous afternoon, and he pushed that aside. "Your original letters from your father," he said. "If they contain any specific description of the land, the deed numbers, the property lines, they may be useful in court. And your patience." She made a small, dry sound that might have been a laugh. "I'm not known for my patience," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because you came here alone with a carpet bag and a letter and walked into a sheriff's office to pick a fight with one of the most powerful land grabbers in the territory," he said. "Patient people take a different approach." She studied him for a long moment, and he felt the examination the way you feel weather coming, as a change in the quality of the air. "Will you help me?" she said. "Not as a sheriff processing a complaint. As someone who actually believes this land should be returned to me." The question was honest in a way that caught him slightly off guard. He had expected a demand or a plea. What he got was a clear-eyed request between equals. "Yes," he said. "I believe you have been robbed of something your father built for you, and I intend to help you recover it." She nodded once. Then she picked up her coffee again. They worked in parallel for the first week, which was how Opal preferred it, though she found herself more aware of Dexter Underwood's movements than she had expected to be. He was methodical and unhurried in his investigations, qualities she respected and found slightly maddening in equal measure, because she felt the urgency of the situation in her bones, and he seemed to carry it with a steadiness she had not yet learned. She spent the days at the hotel writing letters to her father's former cattle hands, whose name she found in his correspondence, to the territorial court in Tucson requesting information on the process of contesting a fraudulent land transfer, and to a lawyer named Marcus Webb who had been recommended by the hotel keeper as the most honest man in Tucson, which the hotel keeper admitted was a competitive category. She walked the town in the afternoons, learning its rhythms. The general store, run by a woman named Bess Carmichael who had the posture of a woman who had outlasted several difficult situations and was not particularly impressed by new ones. The church, where the pastor was young and clearly frightened of the desert but faithful in his way. The saloon, which she did not enter but whose geography she mapped from the outside, noting who came and went and at what hours. She was gathering information. It was what she did when she felt powerless. She gathered information until she felt less so. On the 5th day, Dexter came to the hotel with news. He found her in the small parlor off the lobby, sitting with her father's letters spread around her on the table, making notes. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the papers and said, "You have been busy." "Come in and sit down," she said without looking up. "I found something." He came in and sat across from her, turning his hat in his hands. She reached over and pushed a letter toward him. "Third paragraph," she said. He read it. The letter was from her father, dated September 1879, and in the third paragraph he described the property lines in specific detail, including a reference to a limestone marker at the northeast corner of the property that he had placed himself and carved with his initials. That marker, Opal said, would confirm the original property lines. If Garrison's current deed shows different boundaries, even slightly different, it would suggest the documents were altered. Dexter looked up from the letter. "That is sharp," he said. She felt something warm move through her at the simple directness of the compliment, so different from the elaborate qualified praise Lawrence had occasionally offered and then taken back by implication. "I also have," she said, "a letter from my father dated March 1881, 2 months before he died, in which he specifically mentions that he had written to me about the property and intended to deed it formally to me when he returned to Philadelphia for a visit. He never made that visit. Dexter nodded slowly. So there is a documented intention, he said. Yes. And his will, which was filed with the county court in Tucson, names me as his sole heir and specifically references the land by deed number. He sat back. You have built a solid case, Miss Pritchard. I have built the foundation of a case, she said. What have you found? He reached into his vest pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. I found the man who forged the signature, he said. His name is Remy Dubois. He is a drifter, formerly of New Orleans, who has been in the territory for about 8 months. He is currently working at Garrison's ranch as a paid hand, but before that he was working for a land office in Tucson that was shut down 2 years ago for fraudulent dealings. How did you find him? I talked to a lot of people, he said simply. She studied him. There was something very particular about the way he worked, she thought. No drama in it, no performance. He simply moved through the world gathering what was true and assembling it with care. Can he be made to testify? She said. That is the delicate part, he said. He is currently under Garrison's protection. If I try to bring him in on a subpoena, Garrison will be alerted and things could become complicated. Complicated, she said. You mean dangerous. He met her eyes. Yes, she absorbed this. What is your plan? I have a contact in Tucson, he said. A U.S. Marshal named Henry Pratt. I have written to him laying out what I have found. If Pratt decides this rises to a federal matter, which I believe it does since the fraud involved interstate mail, that changes the reach of the investigation considerably. Federal involvement, she said. That would mean Garrison cannot simply buy his way out locally. That is the idea. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the spread of letters on the table. This will take time, she said. Yes. She had not planned to stay. She had arrived with the vague idea that she would make her report, receive some promise of justice, and then return to Philadelphia to wait. But Philadelphia felt less and less like a place she was returning to, and the waiting felt increasingly like something she could do just as well here, with the advantage of being close to the problem. She said, I would like to see the land. He looked at her carefully. It would mean riding 6 miles, he said. Do you ride? My father taught me when I was 12, she said. He believed a person ought to know how. He smiled then briefly, and it changed his face in a way that was worth watching. We can ride out Saturday morning, he said. They rode out on Saturday before the heat of the day, leaving Caldwell Creek at 6 in the morning with the sky still streaked pink and gold in the east. Dexter had arranged a horse from the livery, a brown mare he recommended with the air of a man who had specific opinions about horses, and Opal had accepted the recommendation and ridden out beside him at a pace that surprised him, she thought, given that he kept glancing at her in the first half-mile before he relaxed and stopped checking. She had not lied about knowing how to ride. Her father had been thorough. They did not talk much on the ride. The desert was different at this hour, cooler and more complex, the shadows long and detailed, the cacti casting their particular shapes across the sandy ground. A roadrunner crossed their path and disappeared into the brush. Hawks were already circling above the mesa. When they came over the low rise and the Pritchard land appeared below them, Opal felt something happen in her chest. She had seen it in her father's letters. She had pictured it for years, informed by his descriptions, the cottonwoods, the river, the flat good ground. But the picture in her mind had been a kind of illustration, flat and contained. What she saw before her was alive in every sense of the word, moving and breathing and catching the morning light in ways she had not imagined. She stopped her horse at the top of the rise and looked. Dexter stopped beside her and was quiet. She could feel his attention on her rather than the landscape. It was not an intrusive attention. It was the kind of attention that asks nothing and simply makes space. My father built that, she said, pointing to the partial adobe structure below. He did, Dexter said. She clicked her tongue and the mare started down the slope. They rode to the house first. She dismounted and tied the mare to what remained of a fence post, and she walked through the door. The interior was dim and hot even at this early hour, the air inside carrying a particular smell of adobe and old wood, and something she could not name, some residue of habitation. There was very little furniture left, a table missing a leg, leaning against the wall. A shelf that had held something once, a door frame to what had been a back room. She walked through slowly. She found on the floor of the back room, beneath a year's worth of dust and debris, a small tin box with a clasp. She picked it up and opened it. Inside was a letter addressed in her father's handwriting. To Opal it read, "For when you come." She stood in the dim room with the tin box and the letter, and felt the grief she had never fully let surface come up all at once, clean and complete and almost bearable, because it was accompanied by something else, the unmistakable sense that she had arrived somewhere she was supposed to be. She heard Dexter's footstep in the outer room. She did not try to compose herself. She had spent too many years composing herself in front of people who required it. She walked back into the front room with the letter in her hand and her eyes wet, and he looked at her and did not say anything consoling, which was precisely right. She held up the letter. "From my father," she said, "left here for me." He nodded. She folded it and put it in her pocket. She would read it alone later in the privacy of her hotel room. But she understood now, standing in the ruins of her father's house on the land that was supposed to be hers, that she was not going back to Philadelphia. Wherever she was going, it was forward, and it was here. They found the limestone marker her father had described, at the northeast corner of the property, exactly where his letter had placed it. The initials AP were carved into it, slightly weathered but clear. Dexter produced a small notebook and recorded the location and dimensions of the marker, measuring from it to two fixed geographic points, the bend in the river and a large outcropping of rock to the north. He was precise and methodical about it, and she stood nearby and watched him work. She said, "You are thorough." He looked up from his notebook. "It matters," he said. "If this goes to court, every detail matters." She looked at the initials on the stone, AP Abraham Pritchard. Her father's name, his presence, reduced to two letters on a limestone rock in the Arizona desert, and somehow more real and solid for it than anything she had left behind in Philadelphia. "We should head back before the heat gets up," Dexter said, straightening from the marker. "Yes," she said. They rode back at an easier pace than they had come, and somewhere on the return journey, the silence between them changed from the comfortable silence of strangers who happened to be cooperating into something else, something she recognized as the beginning of ease. The particular ease of a person whose company you find, against your better judgment, genuinely pleasant. She did not trust it immediately. She had misjudged ease before, but she did not push it away. The response from U.S. Marshal Henry Pratt arrived 12 days after Dexter's letter. Opal was at the hotel when Dexter brought it. He knocked on the door of the hotel parlor where she had been working, and he came in with the letter already open, which suggested he had been reading it on his way over and had not felt the need to perform patience. She liked that. He sat across from her and read the relevant portion aloud. Pratt confirmed that the fraud potentially qualified as a federal offense given the use of the mail system, and he was sending a deputy U.S. Marshal named Tolliver to Caldwell Creek within 2 weeks to take over the formal investigation. In the meantime, he advised Dexter to compile all available evidence and to ensure the witness, Remy Dubois, did not leave the territory. "That last part is the problem," Dexter said, setting the letter down. "Because you cannot simply arrest him yet," Opal said. "Not without tipping Garrison that we are building a case. If Garrison knows, Dubois disappears. Or worse." She thought about this. "What if there were a reason to bring Dubois and that had nothing to do with the land fraud?" she said. Dexter looked at her steadily. "Go on. Is Dubois wanted for anything else?" "You said he worked for a land office that was shut down for fraudulent dealings. Was he named in that case?" "He was not charged," Dexter said, "but he was named as a person of interest. Is that sufficient to bring him in for questioning without alarming Garrison?" "It might be," he said slowly, "if I approach it carefully. if I represent it as a routine inquiry related to an old case. She felt the particular satisfaction of a logical solution aligning. And once you have him in custody for questioning, she said, you can present him with what you know about the Pritchard land fraud and offer him the opportunity to cooperate. Dexter looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, a kind of recalibration, as though he had set his expectations at a certain level and she kept landing above them. You have a legal mind, he said. I have a practical mind, she said. What is the legal term for what I am describing? Protective custody on a related inquiry, he said. It is a stretch, but it is defensible. Then stretch it, she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she realized he was looking at her in a way that was not about the case. It was direct and thoughtful, and she felt it the way you feel sunlight when you turn toward a window. She looked back at him with equal directness because she had learned in the past years that looking away from things only made them more powerful. I will bring him in tomorrow, he said. She nodded. I will be at the hotel. He stood and then he paused at the door and he said, Miss Pritchard. In a different tone, a different register, she looked up. I want you to know, he said carefully, that what you are doing here, what you are fighting for, I think your father would have been glad of it. She felt something move through her that was entirely disproportionate to the words, because the words were simple and the feeling was not. She said, thank you, and her voice was steady, which required some effort. He touched the brim of his hat and went out. She sat for a long moment in the empty parlor and thought about the particular unfairness of finding someone interesting at precisely the moment when the rest of her life was in maximum disarray. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. Dexter brought Remy Dubois in the following afternoon without drama, which suggested he was very good at what he did. Dubois was a slight, nervous man in his mid-30s, with ink-stained fingers and eyes that moved too quickly around a room. He sat in the sheriff's office looking at his hands while Dexter laid out, with a calm that Opal imagined could be more frightening than anger, exactly what he knew. She was not present for this conversation. Dexter had suggested she not be, for tactical reasons she agreed with. If Dubois knew the original owner had arrived to contest the transaction, he might panic. It was better for Dexter to approach it as a routine inquiry first. She waited at the hotel and tried to read a copy of the Tucson newspaper that was 3 weeks out of date, and managed approximately 4 paragraphs before she gave up and paced the room instead. At 6 o'clock that evening, Dexter appeared at the hotel with a look on his face that was not quite a smile but was close enough. He talked, he said. She sat down. Tell me. He talked for an hour. He confirmed that Garrison had hired him specifically to execute the transfer documents for the Pritchard land. He knew the seller was not the actual heir. He was paid $200. He is willing to testify in exchange for consideration on the old Tucson case. Opal's hands tightened on the arms of the chair. We have him. We have a strong case, Dexter said carefully. It still needs to go before the court. But yes, Garrison overplayed his hand. She looked at him across the small space of the hotel parlor, with the lamplight between them and the desert dark outside the windows, and she felt the tension of the past weeks release slightly, not entirely, but enough to notice. Thank you, she said, for taking this seriously from the beginning. He sat down across from her. She had not asked him to sit, but she had not needed to. The invitation was in her posture, and he had read it. He was, she was realizing, very good at reading what was not being said, which she found both reassuring and slightly alarming. I took it seriously because it was serious, he said. Land theft with forged documents is a crime whether the victim is a powerful man or a woman from Philadelphia. She smiled slightly. You said that in a way that suggests you have had to explain it to people before. 1 or 2, he said. She looked at him, and the ease between them was different now, softer at the edges, less careful. Will you have dinner with me, she said, at the hotel dining room, as a way of marking the progress. He looked at her with those gray eyes, and she could see that the question had surprised him slightly, and that he was glad of the surprise. Yes, he said, I will. The dinner lasted 3 hours. The hotel dining room was not elegant, but it was clean and the food was honest, a particular virtue Opal had come to appreciate about this country. They sat across from each other and they talked, first about the case, then about other things, and the transition between topics was so gradual she only noticed it was happening by the time they were already deep into the other things. He told her about Missouri, about coming west at 23 with not much beyond a horse and a specific desire to be somewhere without so many established opinions about who he was and what he was worth. She recognized this desire in herself without saying so immediately. She told him about her father's letters, how she had carried them across the country, how she had read them in the stagecoach and felt, for the first time in years, like she was moving towards something rather than away from it. He asked her about Philadelphia, and she told him about Lawrence Holt with a frankness she had not expected to produce, the engagement, the letter, the particular humiliation of being released by a man who thought her opinions were too large for his parlor. She watched Dexter's expression as she told it, and saw something that was neither pity nor outrage, but was closer to the quiet recognition of a particular kind of injustice. He said, "A man who wanted you to be smaller than you are is not a loss." She said, "I know that. It has taken 6 weeks to know it in the part of me that actually believes things, rather than just understanding them intellectually." He nodded. "Those are different," he said, "understanding something and knowing it all the way through." "Yes," she said. "How do you know that?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee cup. "I have some experience with the distance between those two things," he said. She waited in case there was more. He seemed to be considering whether there was. "I was engaged once," he said, 8 years ago, in Missouri. She was a good woman, and I was a man who was very sure he understood what he wanted and had not yet figured out what he actually needed. It ended badly, not because of betrayal or cruelty, but because I was not the kind of present that a person in a partnership ought to be. I was there in body and somewhere else in mind. She looked at him carefully. "And now," she said. He met her eyes. "Now I am a man who is very much in the room he is in," he said. The sentence was simple, and it was not simple at all. She said, "That is a good quality." He said, "I am finding it increasingly useful." They looked at each other across the table in the lamplight with the particular awareness of two people who have arrived at a place in a conversation where the words are technically about one thing and factually about another, and neither of them has decided yet how to step across that particular threshold. The hotel keeper came to clear the table. The moment reorganized itself without being lost. She walked back to her room that night with the feeling of something beginning, quiet and certain as the cottonwoods leafing out along the river. Deputy U.S. Marshal Tolliver arrived 9 days later on the afternoon stage. He was a compact, efficient man in his 40s with a no-nonsense quality about him that Opal respected immediately. He set up in the sheriff's office, reviewed the case materials with Dexter and Opal together, and pronounced himself satisfied with the quality of the evidence. Colt Garrison, he said, was already known to the marshal's office from 2 other land disputes in the territory, neither of which had been successfully prosecuted due to lack of witnesses. Dubois was the first person willing to testify, and his testimony changed the equation considerably. "Garrison will try to settle," Tolliver said. Opal said, "I am not interested in a settlement." Tolliver looked at her. The land back and financial damages would be a standard settlement offer. "I understand that," she said. "What I want is for Garrison to be held accountable through the court system so that he cannot do this again to someone else. A settlement allows him to pay his way out and go back to his operation unchanged." Tolliver exchanged a look with Dexter that Opal intercepted and correctly interpreted as impressed. "That is a principled position," Tolliver said. "It is a practical one," Opal said. "If he settles this case and is not prosecuted, he continues buying land through fraud. The next victim may not have the resources to contest it." Tolliver nodded slowly. "We will proceed toward prosecution," he said. They arrested Garrison 3 days later. Opal was at the hotel when it happened, but she heard about it within the hour, because Bess Carmichael from the general store appeared at the hotel with the news and the barely contained excitement of a woman who had been waiting a long time for Garrison's presumptions to be checked. She sat with Bess and listened to the account of Garrison being brought in on horseback by Tolliver and 2 deputies with Dexter riding alongside, and she felt something she identified as satisfaction, but which was more complex than that. It was the particular satisfaction of having done the right difficult thing rather than the easy wrong one. She found Dexter that evening on the porch of the sheriff's office. He looked tired in a way he did not usually allow to be visible. She sat down on the railing beside him, which was not a proper thing to do, but she had been in Caldwell Creek long enough to understand that proper was a negotiation here rather than a law. He glanced at her and then back at the street. "It went well," she said. "Garrison tried to have his lawyer there before we got to the office," he said. "Pratt thought it was amusing. Tolliver was less so. Will he make bail? His lawyer will try. The judge in Tucson has already been notified. We have Dubois in protective custody and the documentation is secure." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you all right?" He looked at her again, a little longer this time. "You asked me that question with considerable directness," he said. It seemed like the appropriate tone. He looked back at the street. "I have been doing this work for 3 years," he said. "And every time I bring someone in who has done something that was allowed to run unchecked because the territory is large and law is thin on the ground, I think about how many times it happened before anyone stopped it." "You stopped it this time," she said. "We stopped it," he said. And he said it without any performance of modesty, just as a fact, and she felt it land as such. They sat in the evening quiet together, the street below them emptying as people went in for supper, the sky going through its extravagant evening colors over the mesa, pink and orange and a deep, burning amber. She thought about what she had come out here with, the grief, the fury, the broken engagement ring wrapped in a handkerchief at the bottom of her carpet bag, the dream she had intended to bury. She thought about her father's letter, which she had read alone in her room the night they had ridden out to the land. The letter had been short. It had said, "You are more capable than anyone has told you. This land is yours when you are ready for it. I hope you will be ready. I hope you will come." It had been signed, simply, "Your father," and she had wept for half an hour with her face in the pillow, and then washed her face and gone to sleep and woken the next morning feeling something she recognized very belatedly as hope. She was ready for the land. She thought she might also be ready for other things, things she had not allowed herself to consider seriously since Lawrence Holt's letter had arrived in its wax-sealed envelope. She said quietly to Dexter Underwood in the evening light, "I have decided to stay." He turned to look at her fully. "Not to wait for the trial," she said. "After. I am going to rebuild the house on my father's land and run it as a proper operation. I have been writing letters to agricultural experts at the University of Arizona and corresponding with the Territorial Land Office about water rights. I believe the land can sustain a small cattle operation and possibly a kitchen garden large enough to supply the hotel here, which Bess Carmichael says she would be interested in discussing." He was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read, layered and complicated, but on top of the layers was something that was unmistakably warm. "You have been busy," he said. She recognized the echo of his earlier remark and felt herself smile. "I am always busy when I have a purpose," she said. He said, "Opal." It was the first time he had used her given name. He had been careful with formality, careful in the way that she understood now was not distance but respect, the kind of man who does not assume permission. She turned to look at him properly. He said, "I am glad you stayed." She said, "I am glad you were here when I arrived." The simplicity of the exchange was its own kind of complexity. They sat together in the growing dark, and the space between them was not large, but it was freighted, and she was aware that crossing it was a different kind of decision than anything she had made in this past month of decisions. She had made many practical decisions lately. This would not be a practical one. She said, "Dexter." He said, "Yes." She said, "I think you ought to know that I am not a woman who does things by halves. If I decide something matters, it matters entirely. I am warning you because it seems fair." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with that particular evenness that she had come to understand was not restraint but honesty, "I am not a man who does things by halves either, and I am not in the habit of being afraid of women who know what they want." She looked at him in the near dark, and the stars were beginning over the mesa, and somewhere down the street someone was playing a fiddle in the saloon, something bright and ungainly that floated out into the quiet street, and she thought, "Yes, here, this." She said, "Then we understand each other." He said, "I believe we do." The trial was held in Tucson 6 weeks later in May of 1884. Opal and Dexter rode the stage together to Tucson, a journey of several hours, and she spent most of it reading legal documents while he looked out the window at the passing country, and occasionally said something quietly funny about the other passengers that made her press her lips together to keep from laughing out loud. Remy Dubois testified for 2 days. He was nervous and precise, and his account of Garrison's instructions was specific enough to be believable and specific enough to be damning. The lawyer from Tucson, Marcus Webb, who was as honest as advertised and considerably sharper than his fees suggested, made the case for fraud with a thoroughness that left Garrison's defense with very little to work with. Garrison himself sat at the defense table and looked at Opal with an expression that wanted to be contemptuous and could not quite get there, because the evidence was too solid and too public and too backed by a U.S. Marshal, and contempt requires a certain confidence in one's own position that was increasingly unavailable to him. On the third day, the verdict was delivered: guilty on both counts of fraud, guilty on the conspiracy charge. Garrison was ordered to pay restitution, including the return of the Pritchard land deed, the sum he had paid Forsyth reversed through the court, and a fine to the territory. He would also serve time in the territorial prison in Yuma. Opal sat in the courtroom and heard the verdict and felt the completeness of it move through her like a long-held breath finally released. Dexter was sitting beside her, close enough that their arms were almost touching, and when the verdict was read he turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him, and she reached across and covered his hand with hers and pressed once and did not let go. He turned his hand and held hers and did not let go either. They walked out of the courthouse into the Tucson afternoon, into light and air and the smell of dust and orange blossom from someone's garden a street over, and Opal stood on the courthouse steps with the original deed to her father's land folded into her pocket, and the man beside her in the future opening out in all directions like the territory itself. She said, "It is done." He said, "Yes." She said, "My father would have been satisfied." He said, "I think he would have been more than that." She looked at him. He said, "I think he would have been proud." She nodded. Then she said, "What now?" He looked at her with those gray eyes that she now knew held more warmth than the storm cloud color suggested. He said, "I believe you have a house to rebuild." She said, "I believe I do." And she looked at him in a way that made the pronoun available, the I, large enough to become a we if he chose. He said, "I am a fair hand with adobe construction." She said, "Is that an offer?" He said, "If it is wanted." She said, "It is very much wanted." They took the stage back to Caldwell Creek the following morning, and things between them had not changed in any sudden dramatic way, but had settled into a new configuration, closer, warmer, certain, the way a house settles on its foundation after the last wall is raised. The summer of 1884 was the summer Opal Pritchard rebuilt her father's house. She hired 2 men from Caldwell Creek, experienced with adobe construction, and she worked alongside them, not in a supervisory capacity only but with her hands in the mud and straw, learning the work, because she had decided that this place was hers, and she intended to understand every part of it. Dexter came on weekends and after his duties allowed during the week. He was as good as his word with adobe construction, better than good, it turned out, having built his own small house in Caldwell Creek with help from neighbors when he had first arrived. He and the hired men worked well together, and Opal moved between them with plans she had sketched herself based on her father's original letters and her own modifications. A larger kitchen, a real porch across the south-facing front of the house where the evening shadow fell first, 2 bedrooms instead of 1. She noted, making these decisions, that she was building for more than one person. She noted it without apology and without explaining it to anyone, including Dexter, though she suspected he noticed, because he noticed most things. In July they had the walls up and the roof on, and Opal stood inside the finished main room and looked at the light coming through the 2 south windows, the windows her father had not had, the windows she had added, and she felt the complex, layered satisfaction of having made something with her own hands on land that was hers by right and by effort. Dexter came in behind her and stood in the room with her. "It is good," he said. "Yes," she said. He said, "Your father described this land as the best place he had ever been." She said he was not wrong. And then, because she had been building things all summer and she knew how foundations worked, she turned to face him in the light of the new room and said, "Dexter, I am in love with you." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was the most open she had ever seen on him, all the layers transparent at once. And what she saw underneath was not surprise, but a kind of arriving, the expression of a man who has been walking toward something for a long time and has finally stepped through the door. He said, "I have been in love with you since you walked into my office with a letter in your hand and a fury in your eyes and placed that document on my desk as if it were evidence at a trial." She laughed, which surprised her slightly. He said, "That is the most serious thing I have ever said, and you are laughing." She said, "I am laughing because I am happy." She had not laughed from happiness in so long that it surprised her to recognize it. He crossed the room and took her hands in both of his, and she looked up at him with her hands in his, and the light coming through her windows, and the smell of new adobe, and the sound of the river below the rise. He said, "I would like to ask you something, but I want to make sure I ask it well because it is important and I am better at quiet action than impressive words." She said, "You are better at words than you think." "Ask." He said, "Opal Pritchard, will you marry me? Not because it is practical, not because the territory requires it, not because of anything except that I cannot imagine being anywhere without you now, and I think this land deserves the 2 of us on it." She looked at him, this steady, gray-eyed, unhurried man who had ridden out alone at dawn to see her father's land before anyone could frame it for him, who had found the forger through patient conversation, who had held her hand in a courtroom and had not let go. She said yes, without hesitation, because she had spent too long hesitating and she knew her mind now all the way through. He brought his forehead down to hers and they stood in the light in the new room, and the desert was enormous and beautiful around them, and the cottonwoods were turning gold along the river in the first edge of autumn, and it was, she thought, entirely enough. It was more than enough. It was the kind of abundance she had not known she was looking for when she stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell Creek with a broken engagement ring in her carpet bag, and a dream she had come to bury. They were married in October of 1884 in the church in Caldwell Creek, the one with the peeling white paint, which Opal had offered to help repaint the previous month, and had done so on a Saturday afternoon with Bess Carmichael and 2 other women from the town, so the church was fresh and white on the day she walked into it. The pastor was young and nervous but sincere. Dexter was neither nervous nor performing calm. He was simply present in the way she had come to rely on, which was the most profound comfort she knew. Bess Carmichael cried. Opal did not cry, but she felt everything so fully that the absence of tears was simply a matter of capacity. There was nowhere for them to go because she was already too full of something else. Dexter had written his vows himself, and they were what she would have expected from a man who was better with words than he admitted, specific and honest and not elaborate. He promised to be present. He promised to never want her smaller than she was. He promised to work alongside her on everything they built. He promised to always tell her the truth even when it was difficult. She had written her own vows and promised the same things in different words, and the rightness of that symmetry was its own kind of joy. After the ceremony, there was a gathering in the saloon, which the saloon keeper had cleaned and decorated with a thoroughness that suggested Dexter was more liked in this town than his reserved manner might have implied. There was music, a fiddler and a man with a guitar, and people danced, and Opal danced with her husband for the first time and found that he could dance with a competence he had definitely not mentioned. She said, "You can dance." He said, "I was not sure it would come up." She said, "It came up." They danced twice more before the evening was over. They spent their first winter on the Pritchard land, which Opal had formally renamed and registered with the territorial office as Cottonwood Creek Ranch, for the trees her father had loved. The house was warm and well-made, and she had furnished it with a combination of things ordered from Tucson and things built by hand. A table Dexter made from the timber salvaged from the collapsed west wall of the original structure. A shelf she built herself with considerably more effort and slightly less elegance than she had hoped for. Dexter transferred his sheriffing duties to Caldwell Creek on a schedule that worked for both the town and the ranch, riding in 3 or 4 days a week and home the other nights, with the deputy handling what he could. It was an arrangement that required trust from the town council, which was not entirely immediate but which settled with time, partly because Dexter's competence gave them little grounds to argue, and partly because Opal appeared at the occasional town meeting with such precise and well-organized arguments about local governance that the council members found it easier to agree with her than to resist. She had always had opinions. Here, they were used. In the early spring of 1885, she began the cattle operation, purchasing 30 head of longhorn cattle and hiring 2 permanent ranch hands, one of whom was a young man named Tom Yates from Caldwell Creek, who was 18 years old and had grown up around cattle and was grateful for steady work. The other was a Tohono O'odham man named Kaya, who had worked ranches along the Gila corridor for years and who knew the land and the water and the seasons with a depth of knowledge that Opal had immediately recognized as invaluable and respected accordingly. Kaya taught her things about the land that her father's letters had not contained, where the water ran deep in dry months, which plants signaled good ground, how to read the sky for the weather that mattered out here, not the polite Philadelphia weather she had grown up watching through windows, but the serious weather of the territory that could move from clear to dangerous in an afternoon. She listened to everything he told her, and she was grateful for it, and she said so, which Kaya noted with an expression of quiet approval, because gratitude honestly expressed was not something he encountered as often as he ought to have in this part of the territory. She also started the kitchen garden that summer, expanding it from the modest plot she had planned to a full acre when it became clear that Bess Carmichael was serious about purchasing produce for the hotel, and that the hotel cook was serious about the quality of what he would accept. She grew tomatoes, beans, squash, corn, and more melons than she had intended because the melons came in with unexpected abundance. She also grew a bed of roses, which was not practical and which she did not apologize for. Dexter found her in the rose bed one evening in June, deadheading the spent blooms with a pair of small shears she had ordered from a catalog, and he stood at the garden gate and watched her with an expression she had memorized by now, the one that was the most visible form of what he felt. She looked up and said, "I know they are not practical." He said, "I like them." She said, "I know you do." She had learned to read him by now as well as he read her, which was the particular satisfaction of being truly known by someone who chose, daily, to stay. By the summer of 1885, she was 6 months pregnant, which she had suspected since March, and confirmed in April and told Dexter about in the kitchen of their house on a Tuesday morning with the coffee on the stove and the sun coming through the east window. He had been very still for a moment, and then he had crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her with a carefulness that was also completely certain, and he had said against her hair, "I am so glad." She had said, "Me too." She had not been afraid, which had surprised her slightly. But she was not the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell Creek 14 months ago. She was a woman who had rebuilt her father's house with her own hands, recovered her land through federal court, started a cattle operation, and planted a garden. She had come to understand, equal to considerable things. The baby arrived in August of 1885, a boy, born early on a Thursday morning with the help of the midwife from Caldwell Creek and Bess Carmichael, who appeared uninvited and was entirely necessary. They named him Abraham Dexter Underwood, which was Opal's idea, and which made Dexter go very quiet in the way that meant he was feeling something too large for words. They called him Abe. Abe was a substantial baby with dark eyes that eventually lightened to gray and Opal's copper-colored hair, and he developed opinions very early, which his mother considered entirely appropriate and his father considered both inevitable and endearing. The ranch grew through 1886. They added a second corral and a small barn. They bought more cattle. Tom Yates, who had been with them from the beginning, turned 19 and became genuinely skilled at ranch work, and asked Dexter one spring afternoon if he could be considered for a permanent position with a real wage, which Dexter discussed with Opal that evening, and they agreed on a fair wage that night and offered it to Tom the following morning. Tom stayed. Kaya's knowledge continued to be invaluable, and his presence on the ranch continued to be something Opal was grateful for in ways she expressed practically: fair pay, genuine respect, and the purchase of a small parcel of land adjacent to the ranch that she arranged through the territorial office so that Kaya and his family had ground of their own, which she considered a basic matter of justice, and which Kaya received with the kind of quiet dignity that needed no effusive response. In the evenings, when the ranch work was done and Abe was in bed and the desert had settled into its nighttime sounds, Opal and Dexter sat on the porch she had designed, the south-facing porch where the last light fell, and they talked. Sometimes about the ranch, the practical matters of cattle prices and water rights and the progress of the garden, sometimes about larger things. Sometimes about nothing in particular, in the comfortable way of two people who do not need a topic to enjoy being in the same space. She told him once, on a September evening in 1886 with Abe asleep inside and the stars out over the mesa in their full spectacular abundance, that she thought about the stagecoach journey often. The 12 days of travel, crossing from one world into another, carrying the letters and the broken ring and the intention to bury a dream. He said, "What happened to the ring?" She said, "I left it at the bottom of a creek bed about 20 miles east of Tucson." He raised an eyebrow. She said, "I threw it out the window of the stagecoach somewhere in New Mexico territory. I had been carrying it too long." He laughed, which was one of the things she most treasured about him. His laugh was genuine and unhurried. She said, "I am glad I did not know what was waiting for me here." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because if I had known," she said, "I might have come for the wrong reasons. I came because I was angry and because my father left me something and because I had run out of reasons to stay where I was. That was the right way to arrive. If I had come knowing you were here, I would have been coming for you, and that would have put too much weight on it before we had a chance to build it properly." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is either very wise or very complicated." She said, "Both, I think." He reached over and took her hand in the dark. She leaned her head on his shoulder and they sat in the enormous nighttime quiet of the Arizona territory, and she thought about Lawrence Holt and his letter and the cold February parlor in Philadelphia, and she felt for him nothing but a distant goodwill, because he had been the one to open the door, and she had walked through it into everything that mattered. In the spring of 1887, Opal became pregnant again. This time she was not surprised and not afraid, and the pregnancy moved through the busy months of ranch work and garden tending, with the matter-of-fact quality that Opal brought to most things. She continued her correspondence with the Land Reform Society of Philadelphia, which she had rejoined, this time contributing pieces about women's land rights in the Western Territories that were published in their quarterly journal, and which generated a small, satisfying amount of controversy. Dexter read every piece she wrote, which she had not asked him to do, and offered observations that were consistently useful and occasionally annoying, which was the sign of a genuine reader. He had also, in 1886, formally resigned as sheriff of Caldwell Creek, a decision he had come to gradually and announced to her on a February morning. The ranch needed a full-time partner. The law work would continue through the deputy he had trained. He did not miss it, he said, in the way he had expected. She said, "Do you miss it at all?" He said, "Yes. Sometimes, the solving of it." She said, "You can still solve things. We have a ranch that presents daily puzzles." He said, "It is a different kind of puzzle." She said, "All puzzles have the same basic structure. You find what is missing and you put it in the right place." He said, "You apply your philosophy liberally." She said, "I apply my philosophy everywhere. You knew this when you married me." He said, "I did. I considered it a feature." Their second child arrived in October of 1887, another boy, whom they named for Dexter's father, James, and called Jamie, a dark-haired, determined infant who from his first weeks showed an inclination toward climbing anything that would hold him. Abe was 2 years old and received his brother with the complex mixture of fascination and offense that firstborns produce, and Opal navigated this with more patience than she had known she possessed. Bess Carmichael came to visit and looked at the two boys and looked at Opal with an expression of satisfaction. "You have built something," she said. "I have," Opal said. Bess looked around the house, the well-made furniture, the full bookshelves that Opal had assembled over 3 years of catalog orders and gifts from back east, the map of the ranch that Opal had drawn herself and pinned to the kitchen wall, the roses visible through the south window just beginning to set their fall buds. "Your father would be pleased," Bess said. She had known Abraham Pritchard distantly from the few times he had come into town. Opal said, "I believe so." She looked at the map on the wall, the property lines she had redrawn after the trial, accurate and documented in hers. The little marks where the limestone markers were, the bend in the river, the outcropping of rock to the north. The house at the center of it all, the house she had rebuilt with mud and straw and the labor of her own hands. Bess left after an hour, and Dexter came in from the corral where he had been working with Tom on the fence lines, and he found Opal in the kitchen with Jamie asleep in the cradle and Abe sitting on the floor very seriously arranging a collection of smooth river stones in patterns that appeared to mean something to him. Dexter washed his hands and came to stand beside Opal and looked at his sons and the kitchen and the map on the wall. He said, "Opal." She said, "Yes." He said, "I have been thinking about something." She turned to look at him. He said, "I want to expand the east pasture. I think the water table there is higher than we have been assuming, and if Kaya's right about the underground spring, we could run another 20 head without straining the land." She said, "Kaya is usually right." He said, "Yes." He said also that the Gila is running high this year and we should think about the lower bank before next spring. She said, "I agree." "I have been planning to write to the Territorial Water Office about extending our water rights documentation." He nodded. Then he said, "Are you happy?" She looked at him with the directness that had been her first language long before she had learned the softer languages this life had taught her. She said, "Yes, completely and in the deepest sense of the word." He said, "Good." He said it simply, and she understood it to contain everything. She reached up and touched his face, the weathered skin of his jaw, the lines at the corners of his eyes that were partly sun and partly laughing, and she thought about how she had come here with a broken ring and a grief and a fury, and how she had found instead this man, this land, this life that was nothing like the life she had been trying to build in Philadelphia and everything like the life she had not known she wanted. Her father had known. She had come west to bury a dream, and she had buried it, right enough. She had left it somewhere in New Mexico territory at the bottom of a creek bed, with a ring that no longer fit her. And here in its place, was something so much larger and so much truer that she did not have a word for it in the language of parlors and propriety that she had spoken for the first 26 years of her life. Out here the word was life, simply and fully, life in the whole expanse of the meaning, life the way the desert was life, uncontained and various and capable of a beauty that stopped you in your tracks. That summer they had a photograph taken. A photographer from Tucson came through Caldwell Creek on his way north, and Bess Carmichael, who organized these things, arranged for him to come out to Cottonwood Creek Ranch on a Thursday afternoon. He set up his equipment on the porch, and Opal and Dexter and Abe and baby Jamie and the two ranch hands, Tom and Kaya, who were part of this place as surely as the fence posts and the adobe walls, all arranged themselves in the afternoon light. The photographer said, "Hold still," and they held still, and the shutter closed, and the moment was kept. Opal had copies made, one for the wall of the house, one she sent to her mother in Philadelphia, who had not visited and likely never would, but who had, in the past 2 years, written letters that were gradually losing their quality of accusation and gaining something that was not quite acceptance but was moving in that direction. She sent a copy to Marcus Webb in Tucson, who had won the case and who had become a friend of a particular variety, the variety who sends books you have not heard of and asks pointed questions in letters that you look forward to answering. She sent the last copy to the offices of the Land Reform Society of Philadelphia because she thought it might illustrate something about what the territory could mean for a woman who was willing to make her own place in it. In 1888 they had a dry year, the kind that tested a ranch operation and tested the people running it. Water was scarce and careful, the garden smaller than she wanted, the cattle requiring supplemental feed from reserves she had been building for 2 years, largely because Kaya had told her in 1886 that the territory ran in cycles and a dry year was always coming, and it was the ranchers who prepared who survived it. She was grateful every day for Kaya's knowledge. They came through the dry year intact. The cattle operation held. The garden produced enough for the hotel and a surplus that she sold in Caldwell Creek at the general store. The ranch hands had steady wages throughout. The house was still standing, better than standing. In 1889 the rains came back and the river ran high, and the land was extravagant with green in March and April in a way that Opal photographed herself. She had bought a small camera and was learning its workings because she wanted to record it. She wanted records of this place, multiple kinds of records, letters and photographs, and the journals she kept, because she understood now that documentation was its own form of ownership. Her father had documented in letters. She documented in every medium available to her. That spring she was pregnant again, and this time the news produced the particular domestic comedy of 2 small boys who had been told they might be getting a sibling, and had each developed strong and incompatible opinions about what kind. The baby arrived in November of 1889, a girl this time, dark-eyed and emphatic from the first hour, who they named Clara, after no one in particular, and for no reason except that the name suited her immediately and they both felt it. 3 children. Abe and Jamie and Clara. The house on the land her father had loved, the land she had recovered through law and determination, and the steady partnership of a man who had promised to stand beside her and had kept the promise every day. Dexter held Clara in the big chair by the window on the evening of her arrival, while Abe and Jamie slept exhausted in their room after a day of too much excitement, and Opal watched him from the bed with the particular exhaustion of new mothers that is also its own kind of satisfaction, and she thought, this is what it looks like when you build something true, not the polished parlors of Philadelphia, not the careful performances of a proper engagement, not the small, agreed-upon life she had been moving toward before Lawrence Holt's letter had broken the agreement open. This, a man in a chair by a window, holding a new life with his whole attention, in a house built from the ground up on land that had been fought for and won and worked and loved. She said, "Dexter." He looked up from Clara's face. She said, "Tell me something." He said, "What kind of something?" She said, "The kind you say when you mean it completely." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I would do it all again, every hard day of it. I would choose this and you and this life every time it was a choice." She said, "So would I." The desert was dark outside the window, and the stars were vast, and the coyotes were singing somewhere out beyond the mesa, and the cottonwoods were bare in November along the river. But they would leaf out again in spring, green and trembling, as they had done every year her father had watched them, and as they would do every year after. And the land that had been stolen and recovered and rebuilt upon was as permanent as the limestone marker at the northeast corner, with the initials AP cut into it. Permanent and documented in hers, theirs. All the dreams she had buried, the tidy Philadelphia life, the approved engagement, the future someone else had designed for her, she had buried them well and they had fed the soil. Because here in their place was a life so large and so real she could not have imagined it when she boarded the stagecoach in February of 1884 with grief in her heart and fury in her hands. She closed her eyes in the lamplight. She slept, and outside the stars moved over Cottonwood Creek Ranch as they had moved over the territory for centuries before any of them were there to see it. Enormous and indifferent, and somehow, in their indifference, entirely generous. The years moved forward the way good years do, with the feeling of building rather than passing. In 1891, Abe turned 6 and learned to ride properly, on a small bay pony that Dexter chose with the care he brought to all choices that mattered. Jamie turned 4 and was already more interested in the mechanical workings of the windmill pump they had installed that year than in the cattle it served, which Opal considered an interesting development. Clara was 2 and had opinions about everything, which Opal considered inevitable. Opal's letters to the Land Reform Society continued to be published. In 1891, she was invited to speak at a conference in Tucson on the subject of women's land rights in the Western Territories. She went, taking the stage with the children and Dexter, who managed the children in the hotel room while she spoke, and who, upon her return to the hotel after the talk, told her that 3 separate people in the lobby had congratulated him on having such an exceptional wife, and that he had agreed with all of them. She said, "And what did you say?" He said, "I said she is exceptional in several categories, and I am consistently astonished to be the person she chose." She looked at him for a moment, this man she had known for 7 years and married for 7 years and built everything with for 7 years, and she thought, "I am too. Consistently astonished to have arrived here, at this life, by this road with this man." In 1892, she began teaching a class in reading and basic arithmetic at the Caldwell Creek Schoolhouse on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, which had started as a response to the teacher's illness and had continued because the students were learning, and because she found that she loved it with a fierceness that surprised her. She had opinions about education the way she had opinions about land rights, which was to say thoroughly and based on evidence. The school board had initial reservations about a woman with 3 children and a ranch to run taking on teaching duties, and she addressed their reservations at a meeting with so precise and well-organized a presentation that they voted unanimously to give her the position. Dexter, who had sat in the back of the meeting, walked home with her afterward and said, "You did not need my opinion on that particular performance." She said, "No. But was I right?" He said, "You were right and you knew you were right and you made the case anyway out of respect for the process." She said, "That is the only kind of argument worth making." He said, "I know. I married you for your standards." She said, "Among other things." He said, "Among many other things." The ranch continued to grow in the methodical, sustainable way she had planned from the beginning, not rapid expansion but careful building, the kind that does not overextend and does not overgraze and does not exhaust the land it depends on. By 1893, they were running 100 head of cattle, a proper operation by any measure, with Tom Yates as their ranch foreman and Kaya's expertise integrated into every land management decision. The garden had grown into a small enterprise of its own, supplying 3 establishments in Caldwell Creek and 1 in a neighboring settlement. And she was training 2 young women from town in the cultivation and management of it, because she believed that knowledge had more value when it was shared than when it was hoarded. In 1893, Abe, at 8 years old, became very interested in his grandfather's letters, which Opal had kept on the shelf in the main room and which the children were allowed to handle carefully. She found him one afternoon sitting on the porch reading one, with the particular concentration of a child who is comprehending something new and large. She sat beside him and did not interrupt. When he was done, he looked at her and said, "Grandpa built this house." She said, "He started it. I finished it. He considered this." He said, "Did you know him?" She said, "He was my father. I knew him until I was 16 and then he came here." He said, "Why did he come here?" She said, "Because he believed this land was worth building something on." And he was right. Abe looked at the land, the spread of it visible from the porch, the corral and the cattle beyond, and the river shining in the afternoon and the mesa in the distance. He said, "I am going to stay here too." She said, "You might. Or you might find your own place. Either way is good." He said, "What if I stay and then want to leave?" She said, "Then you leave and you come back if it is right for you and you don't if it is not." He thought about this. He said, "That is very flexible." She said, "Life requires flexibility." He went back to the letter. She sat beside him on the porch of her father's house, the house she had rebuilt on her father's land, the land she had recovered, in the territory she had come to in anger and grief, and had stayed in for love and purpose. And the afternoon light moved across the desert the way it had moved across it every afternoon before, and would move across it every afternoon after, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Dexter came around the corner of the house from the direction of the barn, dusting his hands on his trousers, and he stopped when he saw them on the porch, Opal and Abe side by side in the old chairs with the letters between them, and he looked at them with the expression she knew best on him, the one that was the most visible and least complicated form of everything he felt. He said, "What are you two doing?" Abe said, "Reading Grandpa's letters." Dexter came up the porch steps and stood behind Opal's chair and put his hands on her shoulders, and she reached up and covered one of his hands with hers, the way she had in the courtroom all those years ago, and held on. Abe went back to the letter. The sun moved west over the territory, and the shadows of the saguaro cactus stretched long across the sandy ground, and the hawks circled above the mesa, and the cottonwoods along the river caught the last light, and held it for a moment, trembling gold in the evening wind. And the Underwood family of Cottonwood Creek Ranch sat on their porch in the last of the afternoon, and were, in every sense that the word has ever carried, home.